37 years. That's how long the chandelier has been falling on Broadway. The Phantom of the Opera opened in 1988 and never stopped. 150 million people watched it. The half-mask has become one of the most recognizable symbols in theatrical history, up there with the comedy and tragedy faces themselves. For an entire generation, the Phantom isn't a character, he's an institution. Most people think they know this story. A disfigured genius lives beneath the Paris Opera House, falls in love with a young soprano, and wages war against anyone who stands between them. The chandelier crashes, the mask is torn away, and the monster vanishes into the darkness, leaving nothing but a memory and a melody. It's beautiful and it's tragic. It's one of the great love stories of the modern stage. But the Phantom didn't begin on Broadway. He was born in 1909 in a serialized French novel written by a journalist who spent years investigating the Paris Opera House and who claimed everything that he wrote was based on fact. The building is real, the underground lake is real, and the chandelier really did fall and kill someone. I've spent the last few weeks digging through Gaston Leroux's original novel, the historical records of the Palais Garnier, and over a century of adaptations to piece together this narrative. And what I found is a character far more fascinating and far more disturbing than the romantic figure we think we know. The original Eric, the Phantom as the creator wrote him, is someone Andrew Lloyd Webber never wanted you to meet. Tonight, we're going 5 levels beneath the Opera House, to the underground lake, to the original monster, and to the question of why we transformed him into something else entirely. If you're new here, subscribe to Late Mysteries. Your support helps us to illuminate the stories that live beneath the ones we tell ourselves. Welcome to Late Mysteries. Part 1. The Palace with a Lake Beneath It. Before we meet the Phantom, we need to understand the building that made him possible, because this isn't any opera house. This is a palace built on secrets, with a body count that started before the ghost even arrived. In 1858, Emperor Napoleon III was arriving at the opera when 3 bombs exploded around his carriage. The attack was orchestrated by an Italian revolutionary named Felice Orsini, who believed that killing Napoleon would somehow advance the cause of Italian unification. The bombs were crude but devastating. Grenades filled with fulminate of mercury thrown into the crowd surrounding the imperial carriage. Napoleon and Empress Eugenie survived, protected by the reinforced walls of their vehicle. 8 others weren't so lucky. 50 more were wounded, scattered across the street outside the old Salle Les Pelletiers Opera House, bleeding in the gaslight. The emperor emerged shaken but alive. And standing there in the chaos, surrounded by the dead and dying, he made a decision that would reshape Paris. The old opera house was a death trap, cramped streets impossible to secure, and vulnerable from every direction. Paris needed a new one. It would be the grandest theater ever built, a monument to French culture and imperial power. And it would have a private entrance for the emperor, a covered passage from the street to his box, so he would never be exposed like that again. A competition was announced, and 71 architects submitted designs. The winner was a 35-year-old unknown named Charles Garnier. Garnier had studied at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts and won the Prix de Rome, which sent him to Italy to study classical architecture. But he had never built anything significant. He was a scholar, not a practitioner. His victory stunned the architectural establishment. When Empress Eugenie saw his plans, she was puzzled. The design didn't fit any recognized category. It wasn't purely Baroque, though it had Baroque elements. It wasn't classical, Renaissance, or Gothic. It was something else, something excessive, ornate, almost overwhelming. "What style is this?" she asked. "It's not a style at all." "It is Napoleon III style, madam," Garnier replied. It wasn't a real style. He'd invented it on the spot, a fusion of everything grand he could imagine. The plans called for marble quarried from 7 different locations across France and Italy, Bronze and gold leaf would cover every available surface. Sculptures of Greek gods and French composers would line the facades. The ceilings would be painted with allegories of music and dance. Every corridor would be a gallery, and every staircase a stage. And that grand staircase, Garnier's masterpiece within a masterpiece, was designed not just for ascending, but for being seen ascending. The audience could perform for each other before the opera even began. In Garnier's vision, the building itself was the first act. The structure would be as much about spectacle as any performance inside it. Construction began in 1861. Workers broke ground on what would become the most ambitious building project in Paris. Then they hit water. Beneath the construction site ran an underground stream, part of the ancient hydrology of Paris. The city sits on layers of limestone, riddled with springs and subterranean rivers that have flowed since before humans settled there. Garnier's excavation had broken through into one of them. No matter how much they pumped, the water kept rising. Workers arrived each morning to find their previous day's progress submerged. 8 steam-powered pumps ran continuously for months, fighting a battle they couldn't win. The project threatened to become a very expensive hole in the ground. A lesser architect might have abandoned the site and started over somewhere with more cooperative geology. But Garnier found another solution. He built a massive concrete cistern, a double-walled foundation designed to contain the water rather than fight it. The stream would become a lake, sealed beneath the opera house as part of the building's structure. The water would provide a kind of ballast, stabilizing the enormous weight above it. It was an engineering marvel. It was also deeply strange. A subterranean reservoir, dark and cold, stretching beneath what would become one of the most opulent buildings in the world. That lake is still there today. The Paris Fire Brigade uses it as an emergency water reservoir. If the opera house catches fire, they have thousands of cubic meters of water immediately available. They stock the lake with fish to keep the water clean, catfish now, and carp swimming through absolute darkness, eating the insects and organic matter that would otherwise accumulate. Periodically, divers descend for maintenance. They swim through blackness beneath chandeliers and gold leaf, checking the walls and ensuring the seals remain intact. Above them, velvet, marble, and magnificence. Around them, cold water, silence, and dark. It's the kind of detail a novelist would invent, but it's real. Construction dragged on for 14 years. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War halted work entirely. Prussian forces besieged Paris for 4 months, and the half-finished opera house was converted to military use, first as a warehouse for food and supplies, then as a hospital for wounded soldiers. The grand staircase that Garnier had designed for elegant processions was used to carry stretchers. The ornate halls echoed with the sounds of suffering rather than music. After the war came something worse, the Paris Commune. For 2 months in 1871, revolutionary forces controlled the city, battling the French national government in the streets. Buildings burned across Paris and thousands died. The Tuileries Palace, where French kings had lived for centuries, was destroyed completely, deliberately set ablaze by the communards. Somehow, the opera house survived. Finally, on January 5, 1875, the Palais Garnier opened to the public. It was the largest theater in the world, 17 stories, 7 of them below ground level. 2,531 doors, each one numbered, corridors stretching over 6 miles, if laid end to end. Stables for the horses used in certain productions. Workshops for building sets that were larger than most theaters. Storage for thousands of costumes spanning centuries of opera. Mechanical rooms controlling elaborate stage machinery that could create storms, fires, and floods. Cellars descending level after level into the earth. A person could get lost in the Palais Garnier. People did get lost in it, and almost immediately after it opened, people began whispering about what else might be living inside. The building employed hundreds of workers. stagehands, singers, dancers, musicians, seamstresses, set builders, administrators. And most of them knew only their own small portion of it. The chorus members knew the rehearsal rooms and the stage. The stagehands knew the fly system and the trap doors. The management knew the front offices and the grand foyer. But the cellars, the lower levels, the maze of passages beneath the stage, those were the domain of the rats and the dark. Workers came and went through different entrances, working different shifts, rarely crossing paths with colleagues from other departments. The building had its own internal geography, its own rhythms, and its own secrets. In a structure with 2,531 doors, one more shadow wasn't likely to be noticed. Rumors started circulating within years of the opening. Stagehands reported glimpsing a figure in evening dress in areas where no one should have been. The dancers whispered about a presence in the wings, someone watching rehearsals from the shadows, someone who was there and then wasn't. Some claimed to have felt a breath on their neck when no one was behind them. Others reported hearing footsteps in empty passages, doors that opened by themselves, and voices that seemed to come from the walls. Most dismissed it as imagination. Old theaters creak and groan, shadows play tricks. When you work in a building dedicated to illusion, your mind starts creating illusions of its own. But the stories persisted, and they began to coalesce around a specific location, Box 5. It was a first-tier box, stage left. One of the prime seats in the house, with an excellent view of the stage and of the audience below. The kind of box that should have been reserved for wealthy patrons willing to pay premium prices. But according to the rumors, Box 5 was often kept empty. Notes would appear in the management's office, written in red ink in an elegant hand. The notes demanded that Box 5 be kept available for certain performances. They threatened unspecified consequences if the demand was ignored. Some versions of the story claimed that money changed hands, a monthly salary paid to the opera ghost in exchange for piece 20,000 francs a year, left in a specific location, collected by no one anyone ever saw. How much of this was real? How much was theater? The Palais Garnier thrived on mystique. A resident ghost was good for business. It made the building more romantic, more mysterious, and more worth visiting. Management may have encouraged the rumors. They may even have started them. The opera is, after all, a house of illusions. Creating one more wouldn't have required much effort. But then there were the incidents that couldn't be dismissed as marketing. On May 20th, 1896, during a performance of Faust, one of the counterweights for the grand chandelier broke loose. The chandelier itself, a magnificent fixture of bronze and crystal weighing over 7 tons, didn't fall. But the counterweight did. It plunged through the ceiling into the auditorium below where the audience sat listening to Gounod's music. A woman named Madame Chaumet, a concierge who had been given a seat in the 4th row, was struck and killed. She was 56 years old. She had come to the opera as a treat, sitting in a seat she couldn't normally afford. The accident was real. The death was real. The investigation that followed was real. Engineers examined the mechanism, determined that the counterweight had failed due to metal fatigue, and recommended repairs. But the timing seemed almost theatrical. A death at the opera, a chandelier falling from the ceiling. It was the kind of thing a ghost might arrange. The rumors intensified, and the whispers grew louder. 13 years later, a journalist would weave this incident, along with every other strange story he'd collected, into a novel that would make the opera ghost immortal. But the man who created the Phantom wasn't interested in ghosts, at least not supernatural ones. He was interested in the ghosts that haunt buildings, the histories embedded in walls, and the secrets that accumulate in old structures. He was a crime reporter, a war correspondent, and a chronicler of the Parisian underworld who had spent his career finding stories in dark places. His name was Gaston Leroux, and by 1909 he had become obsessed with the Paris Opera House. Part 2. The Monster Leroux Created. The man who wrote The Phantom into existence wasn't a novelist. He was a crime reporter who had spent his career covering executions, anarchist bombings, and revolutions. He went places other journalists wouldn't go. And what he created in the cellars of that opera house is like nothing you've seen on stage. Gaston Leroux was born in 1868. He studied law at his family's insistence, but the courtroom bored him. The real stories, he realized, walked out of court when the verdicts were read, the aftermath, the consequences, and the human wreckage left behind by crime and punishment. Leroux wanted to follow those stories, so he abandoned his legal career and became a journalist. He was good at it, exceptionally good. He had an instinct for stories that lurked beneath the surface of respectable society. He covered criminal trials, political scandals, and anarchist bombings. He reported on executions, describing the guillotine with the clinical precision of a man who had watched it fall many times. He understood that readers wanted the details, not sanitized summaries, but the raw texture of events. In 1905, he traveled to Russia to cover the revolution. He sent dispatches from the barricades while bullets flew overhead, describing the chaos of an empire beginning to crack. He interviewed revolutionaries and aristocrats, soldiers and peasants, anyone who could help him understand what was happening and why. He had a reputation for going places other journalists wouldn't, for finding stories in the darkest corners of the world. While other reporters stayed in comfortable hotels, Leroux went into the streets, into the prisons, and into the places where history was actually being made. By 1909, he had begun writing fiction drawing on his journalistic investigations. His mystery novel, The Mystery of the Yellow Room, had been a success, an ingenious locked-room puzzle that established him as a serious writer. He was looking for his next subject. He found it in a building he'd always been fascinated by. The Palais Garnier had been part of the Parisian landscape for Leroux's entire adult life. He'd attended performances there, walked its corridors, and heard the rumors that circulated among opera-goers and theater workers. Now he began investigating it systematically. He later claimed to have spent months researching the building. He explored the cellars, descending level by level into the darkness beneath the stage. He interviewed elderly employees who remembered the early years of the opera house, stagehands who had been there since the beginning, and administrators who knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. He was particularly interested in the underground lake. He found ways to access it, to stand at its edge in the darkness, and to feel the strange atmosphere of that subterranean reservoir. He later wrote that the experience was unlike anything else. The absolute darkness, the cold, and the sense of being beneath the world rather than in it. He investigated the chandelier accident of 1896. He was building a mythology from fragments, every rumor, every sighting, and every whispered tale about Box 5 and the figure in the shadows. How much of Leroux's research was real? How much was exaggeration? A journalist's instinct for myth-making? He was certainly a showman. He understood that a story based on true events was more compelling than pure fiction. His later claims about the novel, that everything in it was essentially true, that the opera ghost had really existed, were almost certainly embellished. But his knowledge of the building's architecture was precise. The underground lake, the multiple cellar levels, the placement of Box 5, the route from the manager's office to the back passages, these details are accurate. The novel contains technical descriptions of the opera house that could only come from careful study. Whatever else Leroux invented, he knew the Palais Garnier intimately. Le Fantôme de l'Opéra was serialized in a French newspaper, Le Gaulois, beginning in September 1909. Each installment ended on a cliffhanger designed to bring readers back the following day. The complete novel was published in 1910. The reception was modest. Critics appreciated the Gothic atmosphere and the ingenious plotting. The Phantom seemed like a minor work, an entertainment, a diversion, not the book he would be remembered for. It sold respectively in France, was translated into English and a few other languages, and then faded into the background of literary history. Leroux moved on to other projects. He would write dozens more novels before his death in 1927, most of them forgotten today. He couldn't have known that he'd written one of the most adapted stories in history. He couldn't have imagined the chandelier falling on Broadway for 37 years. And he couldn't have predicted how completely future versions would transform what he'd written. Because Leroux didn't write a romance, he wrote a horror story. In Leroux's novel, the Phantom's name is Eric. Just Eric. He has no surname. He was denied one at birth, denied almost everything that makes a life bearable. He was born with a face so deformed that his mother couldn't look at him without recoiling. She didn't abandon him, not quite, but she gave him his first mask when he was barely old enough to walk. She couldn't bear to see what she had created. Eric never knew a moment when his own face wasn't something to be hidden, something shameful, something that made people turn away. Leroux never specifies exactly what's wrong with Eric's face. He describes it in fragments throughout the novel, as if even the narrator can't bear to look directly. Skin like yellow parchment stretched over bone, a nose that's barely there, just a dark hole in the center of his face, eyes that sit deep in skull, like sockets, glinting in the darkness, lips so thin they seem almost absent. The overall impression is of a living corpse, a skeleton that somehow learned to walk and speak. As a child, Eric was displayed at fairs. Traveling shows in the 19th century exhibited human oddities for profit. Eric was one of them, the living dead man, the corpse that walks. He was caged, mocked, and forced to perform for crowds who paid pennies to shudder at his appearance. Children threw things at him. Adults laughed and pointed and felt better about their own ordinary faces. How he escaped, Leroux doesn't say. But somewhere in his childhood, amidst the cruelty and the cages, Eric discovered two things. First, that he was a genius. He had an intuitive grasp of architecture, engineering, and mechanics. He could design structures in his head, understand how forces interacted, and create mechanisms that shouldn't have been possible. He could look at a building and see its bones, its weaknesses, and its secrets. He could throw his voice, make it seem to emanate from walls, from ceilings, or from empty air. He understood acoustics, the way other people understood breathing, naturally, effortlessly. He could make people hear things that weren't there, and believe things that weren't true. And he could compose music. He taught himself somehow in the margins of a life spent being exhibited. And what he created was extraordinary. His voice, when he chose to use it, was beautiful enough to make people weep. The irony was perfect and cruel, the ugliest face imaginable paired with the most beautiful voice. His mind was miraculous. In another life, he might have been celebrated as one of the great architects of his age. He might have built palaces, composed operas, and been remembered alongside the names we still revere. Second, that his mind would never matter, not to the people who saw his face. The face preceded him into every room, every conversation, and every possibility. It closed doors before he could reach them. His genius was irrelevant because no one could get past his appearance long enough to recognize it. Eric's genius attracted attention eventually. Word spread of a young man, or a creature, depending on who was telling the story, who could build wonders. He traveled east through Europe and into Asia, seeking patrons who would value his skills without caring about his appearance. He found one in Persia, in the court of the Shah. The Shah of Persia, in the mid-19th century, ruled with absolute power over a kingdom that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. His court was legendary for its opulence and its cruelty. Entertainment and execution were often the same thing. The Shah had heard rumors of a European who could build marvels, a man whose face was death itself, but whose hands could create wonders. He sent for Eric, and Eric came. Because what choice did he have? Here was someone willing to pay for his genius, willing to look past his face, and willing to give him purpose. The Shah didn't care what Eric looked like. He only cared what Eric could build. The Shah had a use for a genius, with no squeamishness about suffering. He commissioned Eric to design entertainment of a particular kind, the Palace of Mazandaran, filled with chambers designed for torture and execution. This is where a character named the Persian becomes essential to understanding Leroux's novel. The Persian, we never learn his real name, was a daroga, a chief of police in the Shah's court. He knew Eric during the Mazandaran period. He witnessed what Eric built and what those buildings were used for. Eric designed rooms of mirrors that drove prisoners mad. He designed walls that slowly closed in, crushing those trapped between them. He designed floors that dropped away into pits, ceilings that lowered, and rooms that filled with water, sand, or fire. He designed mechanical devices whose purposes Leroux leaves to the imagination, and the imagination, given permission, goes to dark places. The rosy hours of Mazandaran, the Persian calls them. A bitter joke about the pink light that filtered through certain windows while people died on the other side. Eric was the Shah's private monster, creating horrors for royal entertainment. He was well paid, well housed, and valued for his talents in a way he had never been valued before. Then he learned too much. He knew the palace's secrets, its hidden passages, its mechanisms, and its vulnerabilities. A man who could build such things could also expose them. He was a liability. The Shah ordered him killed. The Persian, for reasons that are partly compassion and partly guilt, helped Eric escape. He arranged for a boat, provided money, and gave him a route to safety. And for the rest of his life, he would feel responsible for whatever Eric did next. Eric fled west, eventually finding his way to Paris. And there he discovered the Palais Garnier, a building with a lake beneath it, with cellars stretching 5 levels deep, with thousands of rooms and corridors and forgotten spaces where someone could disappear completely. Eric didn't haunt the opera house, he made it his home. In the lowest cellar, beside the underground lake, he constructed a dwelling. Not a lair, but a house. Real rooms with real furniture, a sitting room with comfortable chairs, a kitchen with a stove, a bathroom with running water plumbed from the building's own systems, and a bedroom with a coffin instead of a bed, because even Eric had a sense of dark humor about what he was, or because he'd given up on pretending to be alive in the ways that mattered. And there was a music room, dominated by a pipe organ. He built it himself, piece by piece, carrying the components down through the cellars over months or years. In this room, in the darkness beneath the opera house, he could compose and play without fear of being seen. The music would echo off the stone walls and reverberate across the water. And perhaps, if you listen very carefully from the stage above, it filters up through the cellars like something from another world. There was also another bedroom, decorated beautifully in a style called Louis Philippe, ornate, feminine, filled with fine furniture and soft fabrics. It was waiting for someone who didn't exist yet. Eric had never had a home. He had never had a family. He had never had anyone look at him without horror. He was building a life for a woman he hadn't met. He was preparing to be loved. Then he heard Christine Daae sing. Part 3. The Angel on the Walls. What happens next is where Leroux's story starts to feel uncomfortably modern. It's a story about manipulation, about grief, and about what we're willing to believe if we're desperate enough to believe anything. Christine Daae was a young soprano in the opera's chorus, talented but unpolished. She had a voice with genuine potential, but she was raw, untrained in the finer points of technique that separated chorus singers from stars. She was Swedish, the daughter of a famous violinist named Daae, who had toured the concert halls of Europe. Christine had grown up backstage, surrounded by music, watching her father perform as a young person. Then he died a few years before the novel begins. Her grief was still raw. Before he died, her father had made her a promise. He told her that when he was in heaven, he would send her an angel of music, a spirit who would guide her voice, complete her training, and help her become the artist she was meant to be. Christine believed this. She was young, grieving, and desperately looking for something to hold on to. Her father had been her whole world, her teacher, her protector, and her connection to their Swedish homeland. Without him, she was adrift in Paris, surrounded by strangers, working in an opera house where she was just another face in the chorus. When a voice began speaking to her from the walls of her dressing room, she didn't question it. The voice was Eric's. He had discovered the secret passages built into the opera house. Passages that may have been part of the original design used for moving scenery and equipment, or that he himself may have constructed during the chaotic years of construction. He used them to reach Christine without being seen. He spoke to her through the walls. He told her he was the angel of music, sent by her father to guide her. And Christine believed him. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe that her father was still watching over her, still keeping his promises, still there in some form. Eric became her invisible teacher. For months, he coached her voice and corrected her technique, her breathing, her posture, and the placement of her tongue and lips. He expanded her range, teaching her to reach notes she'd never attempted. He taught her secrets of breath and resonance that she'd never learned from any human instructor. He was patient, brilliant, and everything a teacher should be. And he made her feel special, a person who was chosen, the recipient of something miraculous. Christine's talent blossomed under his guidance. The management noticed. She was given larger roles, then leading roles. Other singers whispered about her sudden improvement, wondering where it came from. Christine knew, or thought she knew, her father's promise had come true. The angel was real. And Eric fell in love with her, or what he understood as love. He had never experienced it before. He didn't know what it was supposed to feel like, how it was supposed to be expressed, or what the boundaries were. He only knew that her voice moved him in a way nothing else ever had, that her presence mattered to him, and that when she sang, he felt something he couldn't name, something that made the decades of isolation seem bearable if they had led him to this. She was the first person who had ever responded to him with something other than fear or disgust, even if she didn't know who he really was, even if she thought she was talking to an angel. When her voice was finally ready, when she had become extraordinary, he decided to reveal himself. He brought her down through the mirror in her dressing room. The mirror swung open, a mechanism Eric had installed, and behind it was a passage leading into the depths of the building. Christine followed the voice she had trusted for so long, descending through darkness, through passages that grew narrower and damper as they went deeper. They reached the underground lake. A boat was waiting. Eric helped Christine in and began to pull across the black water. The journey is one of Leroux's most famous passages. The only light came from a lantern at the prow, barely penetrating the darkness. The water was still and cold. Christine didn't know where she was being taken or why. She only knew that the angel of music had become a man in a mask, and that she was descending into some underworld she never knew existed. Above her, the opera house continued its glittering performances. Below her, the darkness pressed in from every direction. When they reached the house, it was almost normal. That's what made it so unsettling. Eric had created a bourgeois home in the bowels of the earth, complete with furniture, artwork, and flowers in vases. The Louis-Philippe room was ready for her, comfortable, even beautiful. He showed her around like a proud homeowner. He played the organ for her. He sang. But Christine noticed that the doors locked from the outside. She wasn't a guest, she was a prisoner. And she had one question she couldn't let go of. What was under the mask? What was he hiding? Christine had to know. She had to see. She waited until Eric was distracted, lost in his music at the organ. She approached from behind, her footsteps silent on the carpet. Her hands were trembling, but she reached out anyway. She tore the mask from his face. The face was in fragments, as if even the narrator can't bear to look directly. Skin like yellow parchment stretched tight over the skull beneath. The absence where a nose should be. Not a deformity, but a void. A darkness in the center of his face, eyes sunk deep in shadowed sockets, glinting with something that might be tears or might be rage. He looks like a corpse, a body that should be in a grave that somehow forgot to stop moving. Christine screamed. Eric's reaction was worse than anger. He wept. He fell to his knees, clutching at his face, trying to hide what she'd already seen. He'd never known anything else. He was born this way. His own mother couldn't look at him. The crowds at the fair had caged him. No one had ever looked at him with anything other than horror. "I am not an angel," he told her through his tears. "And I am not a ghost. And I am not a demon. I am Eric. Just Eric. I am a man who lives in the cellars, and loves music, and loves you. But love on these terms, from a kidnapper, in a prison beneath the lake, with no possibility of escape, isn't love." And Christine knew it. She was released eventually, returned to the surface with warnings. Eric would be watching. Eric was always watching. He knew the opera house's passages, its sight lines, and its acoustics. He could hear conversations through the walls. He could appear and disappear at will. There was nowhere she could go that he could not follow. If she betrayed him, if she told anyone what she'd seen, or if she tried to leave him for another man, there would be consequences. He didn't specify what those consequences would be. He didn't need to. Christine returned to the world above, to daylight and normal people, and the young Vicomte Raoul de Chagny. Raoul had known Christine since they were children together in Brittany. He remembered a little Swedish girl who'd lost a scarf to the sea, and a boy who'd waded into the waves to retrieve it for her. He had loved her in the simple way of childhood ever since. Now they were adults, and he loved her still. Raoul was handsome, kind, wealthy. Everything Eric was not. He wanted to marry her. He wanted to take her away from the opera house, away from whatever darkness had settled over her. But Eric's presence never faded. He sent notes to the managers, demanding that Christine be given leading roles. He sabotaged productions that didn't feature her. Scenery collapsed, props went missing, and performances were disrupted by unexplained sounds and accidents. When the managers ignored his demands, he reminded them why they shouldn't, and then the violence escalated. Joseph Bouquet was a stagehand, a chief machinist who worked the flies above the stage. He'd been telling stories about the opera ghost, claiming he'd seen the figure in the shadows, describing the skull-like face to anyone who'd listen. One night, Bouquet was found dead. His body was hanging from a rope in the third cellar, his neck broken. The official verdict was suicide, but Leroux makes clear that Eric killed Bouquet, strangled him with what the novel calls a Punjab lasso, a specialized rope technique Eric learned in the East. A quick flick of the wrist, a rope that tightens before the victim can react. Bouquet knew too much. Bouquet talked too much. Bouquet paid for it. And during a grand gala performance with Paris society filling the auditorium, with the most powerful people in France sitting in their boxes dressed in their finest clothes, something else happened. The chandelier fell. Not the counterweight this time, but the entire fixture. 7 tons of bronze and crystal, the pride of the Palais Garnier, plunging from the ceiling into the audience below. The chaos was immense. Before anyone could reach her, others were injured, bleeding from shards of glass, from the crush of bodies, from the fall as they tried to flee. The performance stopped. The music died. The opera house, that monument to culture and civilization, had become a scene of carnage. It wasn't an accident. Eric sabotaged the mechanism. He murdered someone, maybe more than one person, to create a diversion, to demonstrate his power, to remind everyone that the opera house belonged to him. The romantic figure from the musical would never do this. Leroux's Eric did, and he was just getting started. Part 4. The Scorpion and the Grasshopper. This is the part of the story that never made it onto Broadway. It is the climax of Leroux's novel, where the Phantom forces Christine to make a choice that has nothing to do with her, that has nothing to do with love. It's about terrorism. It's about mass murder. And it reveals exactly what kind of monster Eric really is. The climax of Leroux's novel brings everyone to Eric's underground house. Christine has been kidnapped again, dragged back down to the cellars. Eric is done waiting. He's done hoping. He's going to force a resolution, one way or another. Raoul follows, desperate to save her. He's accompanied by the Persian, the man who knew Eric in Persia, who helped him escape the Shah, and who has felt responsible for him ever since. The Persian understands something Raoul doesn't. He knows what Eric is capable of. He's seen the torture chambers of Mazandaran. He understands that Eric isn't just dangerous. He's methodical, patient, and brilliant in his cruelty. And he knows the opera house. Eric designed death into that building, not just his home, not just the secret passages, but mechanisms that could kill. But even the Persian doesn't expect what happens next. Eric is waiting for them. He knows they're coming. He probably watched them descend, tracked their progress through the cellars, and let them get just close enough. He traps Raoul and the Persian in a room he calls the torture chamber. It's one of his designs from the Mazandaran days, rebuilt beneath the Paris Opera House, a room that exists only to kill slowly, psychologically, in ways that leave no marks until the very end. The walls are covered in mirrors from floor to ceiling, creating an infinite illusion. When Raoul and the Persian look around, they see themselves reflected endlessly in every direction. There's no way to tell which way leads out. Every wall looks like every other wall. They reach for exits that don't exist, stumble into their own reflections, and lose all sense of space and direction. Then Eric activates the mechanism. The mirrors begin to glow, heated from behind. The temperature starts to rise. The reflections create an illusion of a vast desert landscape, sand and sun stretching to every horizon. The men feel heat pressing in from every direction, see mirages of oases that vanish when they approach. It's a hell of mirrors and heat. Eric designed it to break people before it kills them. The victims go mad from the reflections, from the temperature, and from the inability to find an exit that seems always just out of reach. They stumble through their own images, reaching for doors that don't exist, watching themselves die from every angle. Then the heat kills them. That's what Eric built. That's what he brought with him from Persia. That's what's happening to Raoul and the Persian while Christine watches from the other side of a wall. And then Eric presents Christine with a choice. He has barrels of gunpowder stored in the lowest cellar, enough explosive to destroy the opera house and everyone in it. The performance is still going on above them. Hundreds of people, maybe 1,000, are sitting in the auditorium right now, listening to music, unaware that beneath their feet, in the darkness under the lake, a madman is holding their lives hostage. Eric shows Christine 2 levers decorated with bronze figurines, a scorpion and a grasshopper. Turn the scorpion and she agrees to be his wife. The explosives are disarmed. The torture chamber opens. Everyone lives. Turn the grasshopper and she refuses him. The gunpowder ignites. The opera house is destroyed. Everyone dies, including her, including Raoul, and including Eric himself. He would rather die, rather kill everyone, and rather destroy everything than live without her. That's the choice at the heart of Leroux's novel. Not a love triangle, not who does Christine really love, but will she sacrifice herself to save hundreds of innocent people from a man who will murder them all rather than face rejection? The opera is still playing above them. The singers are still performing, the orchestra is still playing, and the audience is still applauding between arias. None of them know that their survival depends on a young woman's willingness to marry a murderer. This isn't romantic. It isn't even tragic in the way we usually use that word. It's terrorism, pure and simple. Eric has become what he always feared becoming, a monster who would rather destroy everything than be denied what he wants. And Christine has to make a choice. Raoul is dying in the torture chamber. The Persian is dying. The audience above is oblivious. Eric is waiting, patient, certain that he's finally found a situation where he can't lose. Either he gets what he wants, or everyone dies. Christine turned the scorpion. She agreed to be his wife. The scorpion triggered a mechanism that flooded the gunpowder, making it useless. The torture chamber opened. Raoul and the Persian were saved, barely alive, stumbling out of the room of mirrors into the relative safety of Eric's house. And then Christine did something Eric never expected. She kissed him. Not a peck, not a brush of lips given under duress. She took his face, his terrible skull-like face, in her hands, and she kissed him fully, completely, without flinching. It was the first kiss he had ever received in his entire life, from childhood in the cage, through the years of building torture chambers, and through decades of living beneath the opera house. No one had ever touched his face with anything other than violence or disgust. Christine's kiss was the first gentle touch he had ever known. The experience was so overwhelming, so completely outside anything he had ever known, that something broke inside him, or maybe something healed. He released Christine. He released Raoul. He told them to go, to leave, and to forget about him. He wouldn't pursue them. He wouldn't hurt anyone else. The monster, at the very last moment, chose to let them live. The Persian found Eric's body 3 weeks later in the house beneath the opera. He had died alone in the coffin he used as a bed. He left a note asking that Christine be told, so she would know she was safe, so she could bury him with the ring he had given her. The monster died of a broken heart, or perhaps, for the first time in his life, a whole one. But love didn't redeem him. Christine's kiss didn't undo the torture chambers. It didn't bring back Joseph Bouquet or the woman killed by the chandelier. It didn't erase decades of murder and manipulation. It gave Eric one moment of peace, one moment when someone touched him without horror, when someone chose compassion over fear. And then he died. That's the story Gaston Leroux wrote in 1909. It's not a love story. It's a tragedy about what cruelty creates, how a person denied humanity their entire life becomes something that can barely recognize humanity in others. Eric isn't a romantic figure, he's a warning. For 15 years, the novel remained a minor work. Leroux moved on to other projects. He wrote dozens more books before his death in 1927. He couldn't have known what was coming. Then Hollywood found Eric, and everything changed. Part 5. The Mask We Chose. What happened over the next century is a story about transformation. Not Eric's, but ours. About what we wanted from the Phantom. About what we were afraid to see, and about why we keep putting a beautiful mask on something monstrous. In 1925, Universal Pictures released a silent film adaptation starring Lon Chaney. Chaney was known as the Man of 1,000 Faces, for his ability to disappear into roles through elaborate makeup he designed and applied himself. For The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923, Chaney had worn a rubber hump weighing 70 pounds, patted his cheeks with mortician's wax, and glued his eye half shut. He suffered in his costumes. He believed suffering produced truth. For The Phantom, he would create something that made audiences scream. Chaney kept the Phantom's appearance secret during production. All promotional materials showed only the mask, that iconic image of a man in formal evening dress, half his face concealed. Audiences who bought tickets had no idea what they would see. When Christine finally tore the mask away, the unmasking was staged to maximize the shock. Christine approaches from behind, exactly as in the novel. The camera shows her face as she looks at what's underneath, her expression of dawning horror. Then it cuts to Chaney. What audiences saw was a nightmare. His face was skull-like, the skin stretched and yellowed, the cheekbones jutting grotesquely. His nose was flattened and upturned. The nostrils flared into dark holes achieved through wire inserts that Chaney pushed into his own nostrils, a process that caused considerable pain and made breathing difficult. His mouth was distorted by prongs that pulled the lips back, revealing teeth that seemed too long and too sharp. He'd used putty and paint to create hollows where hollows shouldn't be, shadows that made his eyes seem to recede into his skull. The makeup took hours to apply, and Chaney did it all himself, refusing to let anyone else touch his face. Contemporary reports describe pandemonium in theaters. People screamed, genuine screams, not the polite gasps of moviegoers prepared for a fright. Some audience members left, unable to continue watching. This was horror as it was meant to be experienced, visceral and overwhelming. The monster was finally visible, and he was worse than anyone had imagined. But something else happened alongside the horror. Chaney didn't play Eric as a pure monster. Between the moments of menace, he brought a quality of desperate yearning that audiences hadn't expected. When Eric weeps after Christine sees his face, Chaney plays it with such raw grief that sympathy becomes impossible to suppress. When he sits at his organ in an underground house, playing music in absolute solitude, the loneliness is palpable. When he reaches toward Christine, knowing she'll pull away, his hand trembling in the air between them, that image haunted people. The 1925 Phantom is undeniably a horror film. Eric kills people. He terrorizes an entire opera house, and he's the villain, clearly and unambiguously. But Chaney had found something human inside the monster, and he showed it to us. And we couldn't look away. The door had opened just slightly. The first crack in Eric's monstrous exterior. The first glimpse of the tragic figure he would eventually become. The film was a massive success, one of the biggest hits of the silent era. It established the Phantom as a cultural icon. The masked figure, the underground lair, the chandelier crash, the unmasking. These images became part of the visual vocabulary of horror. Other adaptations followed. A 1943 version in Technicolor starred Claude Rains as a more sympathetic Phantom, a violinist whose face is disfigured by acid, whose madness comes from trauma rather than birth. The body count was reduced, the romance was emphasized, and the monster was becoming more human. A 1962 British version, a 1974 television movie, a 1983 television adaptation, a 1989 horror film starring Robert Englund. Each version made choices about what to keep and what to change. Eric's backstory shifted with every adaptation. His crimes expanded or contracted. His face became more or less horrifying. The Phantom was becoming a template, a shape that could be filled with whatever meaning each generation wanted. But the most significant transformation was still decades away. In the 1980s, a British composer who had grown up listening to his father's old film recordings decided that the Phantom story needed one more element, something no previous adaptation had truly given Eric: a voice. Andrew Lloyd Webber first encountered the Phantom as a child. His father, William Lloyd Webber, was a composer and organist who loved film scores. He owned recordings from the 1943 Phantom adaptation, and young Andrew listened to them repeatedly, absorbing the atmospheric music and imagining the story behind the sounds. The image lodged in his imagination, the masked figure at the organ, the underground lair, and the obsessive love for a singer. It stayed with him through his rise to theatrical fame, through Jesus Christ Superstar, Evita, and Cats, through all the shows that made him the most successful composer of his generation. By the mid-1980s, Lloyd Webber could have written anything. He had the resources, the reputation, and the theatrical machinery to stage whatever he wanted. He chose the Phantom. His wife at the time, Sarah Brightman, was a soprano with an extraordinary voice, pure, powerful, and capable of reaching notes that seemed almost supernatural. When Lloyd Webber began adapting The Phantom of the Opera, he heard her singing Christine. More than heard her, he wrote for her. Every soaring melody, every emotional climax, and every moment where Christine's voice lifts into the stratosphere. But Lloyd Webber made a choice that would transform the story forever. He wanted to make a romance. The musical opened in London's West End in October 1986 and transferred to Broadway in January 1988. The production was lavish. The falling chandelier alone cost over $2 million to engineer safely. The changes from Leroux's novel were substantial, and they were intentional. The Persian, the character who provides Eric's entire backstory, who explains the torture chambers and the murders in Persia, who serves as both narrator and conscience, is gone. The musical's Phantom has no past beyond vague references to a difficult childhood. We don't know where he came from or what he did before the opera house. He simply exists, a creature of the cellars defined entirely by his obsession with Christine. The body count is minimized. Joseph Bouquet still dies, but it happens off stage, almost casually mentioned rather than dramatized. The chandelier falls, but the production treats it as spectacle rather than massacre. The gunpowder plot is softened into something more like a desperate gamble than a calculated threat of terrorism. And Eric's face is changed. In Leroux, he's a living corpse, skull-like across his entire visage. In the musical, only half his face is affected. The other half is handsome, even beautiful. The disfigurement is severe but contained. The half mask becomes iconic. That white face, instantly recognizable, almost elegant in its simplicity. It doesn't hide a monster, it hides a wound. But the most significant change was the music. Lloyd Webber gave Eric a voice. Literally, the Phantom sings. And what he sings changes everything. Music of the Nights is the show's signature number. Eric leads Christine through his underground world, singing about surrendering to sensation, about letting go of daylight and reason, about giving yourself over to darkness and music and feeling. The melody is seductive, the orchestration is lush, and the lyrics speak of dreams and secrets and desires kept hidden. In context, this is a scene where a kidnapper is manipulating his victim. Christine has been deceived, brought to an underground prison by a man who's been pretending to be an angel for months. The music doesn't let us think clearly. It washes over us, and we feel what Christine feels: seduction, wonder, and the pull of something forbidden. Lloyd Webber transforms what could be a horror scene into what feels like a love scene. The musical asks a question that Leroux never asked. What if Christine could love him? Leroux's Christine is terrified of Eric, traumatized by her captivity and drawn to him only by pity. Her final kiss is an act of desperate sacrifice. Lloyd Webber's Christine is different. She's drawn to the Phantom even as she fears him. The love triangle between Christine, Eric, and Raoul becomes genuine. She's torn between them, between light and darkness, between safety and danger. When she finally chooses Raoul, it's not obvious and it's not easy. Part of her will always belong to the Phantom. This is a fundamentally different story than Leroux wrote. The monster had become a romantic lead, the horror had become longing, and the terror had become passion. Audiences responded overwhelmingly. The musical became the longest-running show in Broadway history, a record it held for decades. The mask became iconic, worn at Halloween, referenced in countless parodies, and recognized by people who had never seen the show. Music of the Nights became a wedding song. The Phantom had completed his transformation. He was no longer the villain. He wasn't even an anti-hero. He was the tragic romantic figure, the brooding artist, the misunderstood genius who just needed the right woman to see past his imperfections. And the transformation didn't stop there. In 2004, Director Joel Schumacher adapted Lloyd Webber's musical for film. Gerard Butler played the Phantom. Butler was a handsome actor best known for action roles. Casting him signaled something about how the studio saw the character. His disfigurement is minimal. The prosthetic makeup gives him what looks like a severe skin condition on one side of his face. Redness, some scarring, and some discoloration. It's unpleasant, but it's not monstrous. The unmasking that made audiences scream in 1925 now reveals not much. The horror has been sanded away. In 2010, Lloyd Webber staged a sequel called Love Never Dies. The premise asks audiences to accept that Christine and Eric had a secret encounter before she left with Raoul at the end of the original story. They spent a night together, and she's been longing for him ever since. In the sequel, their connection is revealed as the true love story all along. Raoul has become an alcoholic, a gambler, and an obstacle to be overcome. Eric has become the romantic hero. The kidnapper is now the love interest. The monster has been fully rehabilitated into the man Christine should have chosen. Each new adaptation makes Eric more sympathetic, more beautiful, and more deserving of love. So why do we keep transforming monsters into lovers? The Phantom isn't unique. Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights is obsessive and cruel, but generations of readers have found him romantic. Rochester in Jane Eyre keeps his wife locked in the attic, but he's the hero of one of the most beloved love stories in English. The vampire, the werewolf, and the beast who can be tamed by beauty. Our fiction is full of dangerous men we're invited to desire. The Phantom represents a powerful fantasy, that love can transform anyone, that the right person can reach the most broken soul, and that behind every monster is just a wounded heart waiting to be healed. It's a fantasy that gives love a kind of magic. It means no one is beyond redemption. It means our affection has the power to save people, to fix what's broken in the world. And maybe, by extension, it means someone could love us the same way, could see past our own masks, our own flaws, and the parts of ourselves we're afraid to show. Leroux's novel doesn't offer that comfort. His Eric can't be saved by love. Christine's kiss doesn't transform him into a better man. It gives him one moment of peace, and then he dies. The decades of isolation, the years of killing, and the damage that was done to him and that he did to others. None of it is erased by a single gesture of compassion. That's a harder story. It suggests that some damage can't be undone, that some people are shaped by their suffering into something that can't be reshaped, and that love is powerful, but not magic. We prefer the version where love is magic, so we keep rewriting the ending. But maybe we don't need to choose between them. The original Phantom shows us how monsters are made. It asks uncomfortable questions about cruelty and its consequences. Eric becomes a monster because he's treated as a monster from birth. His mother recoils from him. The crowds at the fair cage him like an animal. No one ever gives him a chance to be human. The torture chambers, the murders, and the terrorism. These are the end result of cruelty compounded over decades. Eric does terrible things because terrible things were done to him. The modern Phantom shows us what we long for: connection despite our flaws, love that sees past the mask, and the possibility of being accepted as we truly are. Both versions are true to something in human experience: the horror of what we might become when we're denied humanity, and the hope that someone might love us anyway. Perhaps that's why the story endures, not because it's a simple romance or a simple horror story, but because it contains both. It holds the darkness and the dream in the same hands, letting us feel both the terror and the longing. We need stories that show us how cruelty creates monsters. We need to understand that chain of causation, to see how the cages and the crowds and the turned faces add up over time into something terrible. But we also need stories that offer hope. We need to believe that even the most damaged among us might find a moment of grace, that even at the very end, connection is possible. Leroux gave us the monster. Lloyd Webber gave us the dream. The mask stays on because we need it to. Behind it, both faces are waiting. The Palais Garnier still stands in Paris. It's a working opera house. Tourists line up to walk the grand staircase, photograph the ceiling, and sit in the red velvet seats to imagine the ghosts of performances past. The tour guides will point out Box 5. They'll tell the story of the opera ghost with a knowing smile, as if it's all legend. But they'll pause for just long enough to let you wonder. The lake is still down there, dark, cold, and silent. The fire brigade maintains it and sends divers down periodically. The water stays clean enough, though no one would want to drink it. Gaston Leroux died in 1927, 2 years after Lon Chaney's famous film was made. He never saw the musical, he never saw Gerard Butler, and he never saw the mask on Broadway posters or chandeliers falling for 37 years. He was a journalist who wrote a Gothic novel, and then the monster escaped him, transformed into something he never intended. That's what stories do. They escape their creators and become what audiences need them to be. The Phantom has worn many faces over the last century. Leroux's living corpse, Chaney's nightmare, and Lloyd Webber's wounded romantic. Each face reveals what we wanted from the story in that moment, what we feared, what we longed for, and what we were willing to forgive. Both versions tell us something true. The original shows us the horror of what cruelty creates. Cruelty compounds over the decades until it becomes something monstrous. The modern shows us what we hope for, that love might reach even the most broken among us. Somewhere beneath the Paris Opera House, the water is black and still, and Eric is waiting. He's been waiting for over a century now. Every time someone buys a ticket, every time the chandelier falls, and every time the mask is finally removed, he gets to be seen again. Not as he truly was, but as we've chosen to remember him, the monster we made beautiful, the face we can bear to look at, and the love story we needed more than the horror story we were given. If this video helped you hear the silence beneath the music, subscribe to Late Mysteries. We illuminate the dark corners of history, the stories that live beneath the ones we tell ourselves. Until next time, keep the candle lit.